Anything man can imagine is a possibility in reality. This quote was said apparently by Willie Caron, a fictional physicist within the world of One Piece. While I'm not here to deduce who this Willie Caron is, I do want to focus on this quote, when it appeared in the story, and to discuss a theory that I've been perplexed by for a while now. You have probably heard me mention my Pluton theory several times and heavily hint at it at times too, but making this video is harder for me because I get a little confused at the end. There's several ways to synthesize the ideas to make sense of it all, but the reason why I want to post this is because I think along the way of this theory, it highlights a lot of mysterious details and creates a bunch of connections that are exciting. As most of you already know, I like posting the random thoughts that make people smile and connecting ideas that sound crazy, all so that we can be a little bit more open-minded. But so if you're new to my channel, the way I view the world is by making connections. So let me connect you to my vision, the ParVision. So let's talk about Pluton. When we are first introduced to Pluton in chapter 193, Crocodile says one shot of it can vaporize an entire island to smithereens. Named for the god of death, it was the most terrible weapon of the ancient world, and it's sleeping somewhere in this kingdom. Now, in the current story, we have received some updates about Pluton, but I wanted to start here to highlight some interesting points. See, one thing that we have yet to understand within the story is how Crocodile even has this information about Pluton. Crocodile's allegiances will surely answer this for us. I mean, we know so little about Crocodile's backstory that there's a minority part of the community that very strongly believes that Crocodile is Luffy's mom, and a larger faction that would accept a female Crocodile origin story. But getting back on topic, the thing about the ancient weapons is that the original ancient weapons seem to only be recorded on poneglyphs. With the exception of the Oharans, the Kozuki, and the Gorosei, it doesn't seem like that information is accessible to most people, and aren't really the things that have become rumored within the One Piece verse. But we have two examples actually of ancient weapons being known by people outside of the group mentioned before, and that is Crocodile with Pluton and the original Vanderdecken with Poseidon. As I mentioned in my Vanderdecken mushroom video, there's a few likely possibilities for the original Vanderdecken to have gotten that information. And also, I'm not including the likes of Kaido and Big Mom, as they have never named an ancient weapon. They simply talked about the classification of the weapons. So that's one major point with Pluton and Crocodile's retelling of its powers. We do have to question its synthesis by Crocodile, but we'll get back to that in a second. The next thing I want to highlight is this theme laid out by Oda that served as a preface for the Pluton reveal in chapter 192, and that was that whatever its original purpose, anything that can be used to kill people is a weapon. Even a face. See, this quote is really powerful because this quote makes you realize that Pluton being a terrible weapon may simply have come from the possibility of it killing people. Maybe the original purpose of Pluton had nothing to do with killing people, but because of the Void Century, which we know nothing of, it gained a reputation that made it feared. If it's truly a ship, then I like to refer back to what Tom said about shipwrights and ships. He told Frankie that there's no such thing as blueprints for a pirate ship. If the sailors who board that ship run up a skull and crossbones, then it's a pirate ship. If they fly a seagull flag, it's a navy ship. I like that quote a lot because if you apply it to Pluton, then it's not a battleship. It's just a ship that was used for battle. But that's not all it has to be, right? I mean, even Tom's sea train was designed as a steam engine paddle ship. The lack of boundaries for what Tom, the legendary shipwright, considers a ship is really interesting. I mean, that's why my favorite Pluton theory at the moment is Dax Sake's Pluton is a mole theory, but we'll talk about that later. So if we take a step back, Pluton being a weapon and a ship are both things that could be taken with a grain of salt, especially when it comes to understanding what Crocodile was telling us. Now, one last detail before we add some context is the blueprints for Pluton. What we learned from Water 7 and Enies Lobby, and specifically through Iceberg and Tom, was that in the world existed blueprints that had Pluton written on it. But these weren't exactly blueprints for Pluton, but based on what Iceberg said, These blueprints were a counter-weapon to Pluton created by the ancient shipbuilding engineers that made Pluton thought that the weapon of Pluton was so powerful that there was a reason to make an opposing force just in case Pluton went out of control. That doesn't mean that these blueprints recreate a Pluton, and rather to me lends itself to the idea that whatever these blueprints create, it creates something equally as devastating as Pluton, but specific to taking down Pluton. And the other important thing about these blueprints is that because these exist, unlike the other ancient weapons, there exists records outside of the poneglyphs that we know of that refer to Pluton. But again, these blueprints and the rumor of these wouldn't tell you the real Pluton details like the poneglyphs would. Now, what's interesting is that the blueprints and their information could be what Crocodile heard of, and the rumors he heard of was not of the original Pluton, but rather the blueprints of the counter Pluton. And that creates another weird situation that still isn't answered. Why was Crocodile searching in Arabasta? Regardless of where he heard the info about Pluton, for some reason it led him to Arabasta, and that was with Robin's aid, who at the time was genuinely searching for clues. The Gorosei seem to know it was on Water 7, but that may be due to the fact that they are privy to the knowledge of the ancient shipwrights history. Knowing where the ship was built probably led them there. What's interesting about all of these points is the lack of clarity that Oda created about this, which makes complete sense because of the fact that the original history is hidden, leading to the several offshoots of people trying to find the truth, including us. So now let's add the most recent things we learned about Pluton that we found out in chapter 1055. We found out through Sukiyaki that the ancient weapon Pluton is said to rest in Wano, which is directly contradicting the info that Crocodile had saying it was resting in Arabasta. But what we learned from Robin was that the poneglyph in Arabasta said that Pluton was in Wano, so it makes it clear to us that there's something unclear here. How are the two mistaken for each other? There's definitely a connection between the two places. I mean, Arabasta and Wano had to be allies of some sort, as the poneglyphs contained important evidence of history created by the Kozuki, and logically it would have been entrusted to allies. We also know that the Nefertari family, though part of the original 20 kingdoms, had some kind of duality in who they allied with, as they were also the only kingdom whose monarch chose to stay in their kingdom, which the Gorosei said to be an act of betrayal. But maybe it wasn't Pluton that was resting in Arabasta. It was the counter Pluton that Crocodile might have heard of that could have been present in Arabasta. But going back to what Sukiyaki told us, it's that further down into the earth underneath Wano and Old Wano and presumably Mount Fuji is where the ancient weapon Pluton is said to rest, which I think we can take at face value because this was verified by the poneglyph that Robin read in Arabasta. Now, Sukiyaki said in order to retrieve Pluton, the walls need to be torn down. In other words, opening the borders means destroying the country's natural defenses and unleashing an ancient weapon onto the world. What's interesting is based on this story, he said at some point great walls grew around the island, so it's not like those existed prior, but also that these walls grew rather than being built. I wonder if that's a side effect of Pluton. But before we get to another point, this is something that I've talked about several times before. If we were to assume that poneglyphs talking about ancient weapons follow a format, then Poseidon's poneglyph on Shandora said Poseidon's name, where it was, and the power it held. It was descriptive enough that the moment Robin saw Shirahoshi unleash her powers, Robin knew Shirahoshi was Poseidon. So I would imagine if the poneglyph on Arabasta contained the name of the ancient weapon, Pluton, where it was, which is Wano, then I would imagine it also told Robin what Pluton actually does, as would be stated on that poneglyph. Which brings me back to this original point. The only thing that really has stayed consistent outside of the various descriptions is the name Pluton. Regardless of the source, Pluton is the one consistent thing. So let's talk about that name. Pluton seems to be the Greek name for the Roman god Pluto, which is essentially synonymous with Hades, who is the Greek god of the dead and king of the underworld. It makes you wonder why Oda chose the naming scheme for the ancient weapons that take the Greek god Poseidon, Greek titan Uranus, and the modern Greek name for Hades, Pluton. I say modern Greek name because unlike the Roman god Jupiter, the Greeks still choose to call this god Zeus. I don't blame them, it's way cooler. But for Hades, Pluton or the newer name is more commonly used. And so anyways, I'll talk more about some details about Pluton in mythology in a little bit, but let's focus on some possibilities of Pluton within One Piece. So something always discussed is, what is Pluton? Is it a person, place, or thing? Given the idea that Pluton is a battleship of some sort, I'd refer us back to what Tom taught us. Anything that travels essentially over the water is a ship, as we refer to his sea train as a paddle ship. And even more, the type of ship that it is not determined by the shipwright, but rather the sailors who use the ship. But even more than that, the possibility that Pluton is a person is an option, as Oda created the precedent of naming San Juan Wolf the colossal battleship. A devil fruit user that allows for sea travel opens up the possibility that Pluton could be a living creature, like a Zunisha. But then we got the understanding on Wano that Zunisha is needed to open up Wano to unleash Pluton, so given those context clues, we get a completely different understanding of what Pluton could be. So let's go back to the underworld context real quick. Pluton being a ship would mean to me that this ship has some sort of attribute related to the underworld talked about in Greek mythology. The underworld was described as a place of darkness where no sunlight came, but also it was the afterlife where the souls of the dead would gather and also in some contexts be judged. So then how could that apply to a ship and in the One Piece world? But you know how I work. I always look for something similar within the series, and there actually is something. Something that I've been teasing for many videos now. It came up in the Nolan video before, and I'll give you a little bit to try and remember it. While you think, the thing I wanted to give you context about is ships. Clearly, ships are a super flexible term within One Piece, but something we found out about Pluton was that it was supposedly built originally in Water 7 and it traveled to Wano on the other side of the planet. And while a traditional ship could do that, we do have to acknowledge that a traditional ship would have to go through Fishman Island, unless the Red Line wasn't formed or something by that time. But we know that the Lunarians resided on top of the Red Line at the minimum. But then there's also Germa's ships that crawled over the Red Line. And then we don't know about Zunisha and how it interacts with the Red Line, but then there are ships like Morgan's ship and the Arc Maxim that can fly. So what kind of ship can be the underworld and travel? And that's where we bring in something that would be technically a ship, as you can travel on it and we know it moves and it does bring the underworld. And that is the Emperor Cloud, the Imperial Cumulus. If you remember when the Emperor Cloud appeared, it brings instant nighttime. When Cricket was describing it to Luffy and the crew, they questioned Cricket's sanity and saying that when it gets dark because of a lot of clouds, it's called being cloudy, not a sudden night that creates total darkness. But Cricket doubled down and said it actually is so dense that it blots out the sun. On top of that, it seems to be a petrified cloud that is incapable of dispersing on its own, which is typically achieved through the rain cycle. As Cricket says, according to one theory, the Emperor Cloud has remained unchanged for thousands of years, like a petrified cloud that floats in the sky. I think a more direct translation comes up saying that it's a fossil of a cloud. I wonder what this cloud was like originally. Maybe it was a lot bigger. But at the minimum, we can say that technically this cloud does bring the underworld. I mean, just look at the Straw Hat's reaction from being under there for 1 second. Controlling the Cloud King, just like Poseidon controls the Sea Kings. On top of that, we do know that the Emperor Cloud migrates and moves in the sky. It's such a grand platform that could act like a ship. It would be able to easily move to any place in the world and also be equated to an ancient weapon. Imagine you were a country and one day this cloud hovers over you. Death most certainly would follow afterwards. Portable eternal darkness like that can definitely be weaponized, but it's also something that does not necessarily need to be a weapon. Just like how Shirahoshi is an ancient weapon, but she has the potential for good if used correctly. Considering this cloud blots out the sun, it would be pretty on point if the sun god was steering it. Who better to use it correctly? But backing up now, There are a lot of things I like about this idea, and I hope there's a lot about this idea that you are liking so far. If you are enjoying your time, give me that thumbs up, hit that like button, and subscribe if you aren't already. But yeah, the first reason as to why I like this idea is that 1, we interacted with the Emperor Cloud just after the Arabasta arc, which was centralized about discovering Pluton. So how ironic would it be that right after that arc, we then unintentionally interacted with Pluton or a version of Pluton. On top of that, right after the Sky Island arc, we get Enies Lobby, which was also centralized about reawakening Pluton or the counters to Pluton, which we'll get into. But that's where Enies Lobby is really interesting, because you might remember that Enies Lobby or Judicial Island is also known as Never Night Island, and I wonder why it has that feature. How is that even possible? And how ironic if the Pluton they were searching for would be something that could counter Enies Lobby's direct unique attribute. I also like it because Franky has not interacted with the Sky Islands from our understanding, so none of this would be something he innately experienced and thus could connect to Pluton. But something everyone has tied to Pluton theories are those blueprints, but as we mentioned before, those were the counter weapons, which is really interesting, because is there a counter weapon for the Emperor Cloud? Yeah, I think there is. I think there's blueprints to make the Emperor Cloud, but also to take it down. First of all, we already discussed the weakness of the Emperor Cloud, or rather its strength. But my 2 cents is that any weakness can be turned into a strength, and any strength can be turned into a weakness. So we know that Emperor Cloud doesn't rain, which is how it preserved its existence. But we do know that it absorbs moisture from Connus's dad, Pagaya, and that's super important, and we'll touch back on that. But so we know it can rain. So do we know something within the verse that can make it rain, other than Bonnie's feet and female law? Oh, what's that? We do? The also mysterious dance powder? And you know what's super ironic about that? Is that the dance powder is actually super fitting for the description of Pluton that Crocodile gave, or rather the counter Pluton that was touted as the actual Pluton during the Water 7 and Enies Lobby's arc. It would be super ironic if the weapon that Crocodile had been searching for the entire time was the weapon that he had the entire time, and that he manufactured. If you think about it, one shot of it could actually destroy an island, and that was the exact fear the citizens of Arabasta had, that their island was going to ruin due to the use of this. Given we were introduced to Pluton in Arabasta, during this arc we were introduced to this devastating tool, and thereafter the cloud that it could be used on. Oh, on top of that, we see this kind of ship that was used to utilize the dance powder. It was called Downpour, the rain-making ship, and essentially looks like a giant bucket with a giant cannon in the middle and on top of it. Imagine if this was the ship that Franky and Iceberg saw. From a blueprint perspective, it could just be a giant cannon ship much larger than the one Crocodile had, which would explain the absurdity of it. But also the reason why Franky was drawn to it, because without knowing what kind of ammo fits in the cannon, you'd think it just uses a giant cannonball or something, but what if it was just dance powder? This is where we start answering some interesting questions. So if we take Pluton to be the Emperor Cloud, and it was built on Water 7 and laid to rest in Wano, after making Pluton, the counter weapon to take down the cloud was made, which would be the dance powder. But we don't know who or where the counter Pluton was developed. But we do have the lore of where dance powder was created. Explained to us by Nami on chapter 161, it is explained like this. They call it the powder that summons rain. It was developed by a scientist in a country where it never rains. The powder turns into mist and rises up to the sky, where it triggers ice particles to grow in the clouds and fall as rain. Dance powder creates artificial rain. At first, people rejoiced in the land where dance powder was invented, but then they discovered a terrible side effect. The country's upwind suffered a dry curse. It steals the rain that would normally fall on the surrounding lands. That's right, when the neighboring countries realized what was happening, they attacked and many lives were lost. After that, the world government banned the production and use of dance powder worldwide. So then this stuff causes happiness and misfortune at the same time. And so what's really interesting to me about this is nearly all of that connects to Wano, where Pluton was supposedly laid to rest. Now, I might have lost you with that, so let's take this in steps. Why is dance powder connected to Wano? So first, we still have no inkling as to why Wano was known as the Land of Gold. We have seen new Wano, old Wano, seen the products of Wano, and nothing really ties it to the massive gold reserves like Shandora, for example. But what if I told you that was the actual lore of Japan? Marco Polo claimed to the Western world that Japan was Zipangu, or a country of gold, when it was probably just because he saw one temple that was covered in gold. But in the One Piece world, Wano seems to have a lot of water but not gold of any kind to make it be claimed the Land of Gold. And what's interesting about this is the kanji Oda uses for the Land of Gold for Wano. He uses this kanji that, pardon my pronunciation, is said as Oga no Kuni. But the important part is how he says gold. You might be familiar with the word kin, which means gold, and it's pretty straightforward what kin refers to. But to make sure we are sure of what we're talking about, Oda added the kanji character here, which is yellow. So to make sure we know that gold is yellow, he added that. But by doing so, instead of translating it as Land of Gold, Golden Land could also be accurate, which is interesting because Arabasta is a desert and it's golden, but Wano didn't really give that vibe in totality. So if they don't have gold, and this might not even refer to the mineral gold, then what could it be? Maybe just like the real Japan myth about it being the Land of Gold, Wano had the same thing. See, the interesting thing is dance powder seems so fictional, but what's funny is Oda based it off a real invention that is used in our world, and we know this because Crocodile said to make dance powder he needed silver, and the real life inspiration for dance powder is silver iodide. The exact mechanics match, as it's made to encourage ice particle formations in clouds, just like Nami says, and it does nearly the same thing. But here's the interesting part. Guess what color silver iodide is? It's not silver, it's gold. So what I'm saying is Wano could have been the home of silver iodide stockpile or dance powder. But is that the only thing that lines up? No, it's not. See, the name dance powder is so particular. It was made in a land where it didn't rain and it made people so happy they danced. But what if I told you there's a region in Wano that connects? On the surface, all the Wano regions are named after food, but one of them is an outlier. It's Hakumai. Hakumai means white rice, but as you know, there are ways to write the same name with different kanji, and so instead of the typical white rice writing here, it actually translates to white dance. So isn't that interesting? White dance, I wonder what that referred to. Dancing so the white clouds would form and eventually rain? And there's so much more. We know that dance powder can affect surrounding climates, and something that's always been super odd about Wano is the climate. It has all the climates in one island, and the outer climate region is super volatile. Maybe it's due to the long-term use of dance powder in the white dance region. And if you think I'm done, I'm not. There's more connections even now. So what's really interesting about the lore of dance powder is that there was a war that ensued due to dance powder. Dance powder was that devastating, but how do we remember this war? Doesn't that imply that it was after the Void Century? I mean, Nami was the one who filled us in on the details, but we don't know how long ago this was. But she said that the world government banned the substance, but not just that, the neighboring countries attacked the region. Doesn't that story reflect the exact story Ryuma had? The world wanted the gold on Wano, but what if it was just dance powder? Or for them to stop using it? And even the world government had to get involved, just like the Ryuma story. It could have been that the world government was chasing a power that was extremely alluring, but was met by the might of Ryuma and ultimately deterred. The disconnect of all of these details is beautiful because while this is a core component of Pluton, it's not like it would be super apparent. So while the world government was searching for Pluton, the Rainmaker ship, dance powder, and all of these components were separated enough where we could get the distinctions we have in the story, where multiple people intentionally or unintentionally interacted with what they were looking for, not realizing it was the treasure they were seeking the entire time. And now, speaking of blueprints, remember what the Rainmaker looked like? I laughed at this one, but doesn't that literally look like Wano? Where the bucket of the ship is the outer walls, but also Mount Fuji is the giant cannon. I'd imagine if that's what the blueprints that Franky looked at, then I'd be equally excited and confused and overwhelmed by what I saw. And that brings us to the last but maybe most important connection here. It's what Sukiyaki explained of Old Wano. So these walls grew around Wano, but if they are broken, then also Pluton is immediately unleashed? But if we were to use simple logic for a second, if the walls of Wano are broken, the thing that is immediately unleashed is just the water. And also the confusing history that Sukiyaki told is that it just rained until the entire caldera was filled. But what if in the past Wano stockpiled fresh water by using dance powder on Pluton? Because we don't know how expansive Pluton was meant to be. It could be that the Emperor Cloud, being the fossil of a cloud that it is only a remnant of the original cloud. The dance powder was used to dissipate Pluton and lay it to rest, and it was captured and held within Wano's bucket, which would explain the massive rainfall that apparently happened to create Wano's current environment. One other really important detail is something Robin said about Old Wano that truthfully doesn't make sense even with her explanation. She claims that Old Wano must be preserved well due to the fresh water present, but even fresh water wouldn't preserve ruins like that. Maybe the water has a special preservation property, similar to how the Emperor Cloud was said to be fossilized or preserved for thousands of years. It seemed like Old Wano was also preserved, further linking the two with a similar property. If the water has some kind of preservation ability, that could connect back to the underworld, as life or lack of life is more of a permanent and preserved state as opposed to that of the mortal world. There's clearly something important about this water. Going into Wano, there was something notable about the water and the weather. We still don't know what's causing the roiling waves that Nami says is unique to only Wano in chapter 910. A secret page that I'll tell you about, because I will use this in future videos and in another Pluton option video, but Nami in this secret chapter says that the difference in water salinity can create currents. That's probably exactly what Wano's situation is. Now, part of Pluton being dissipated over Wano, creating the giant pool of water, explains the occurrence and the purpose of the walls. Now, I know that this theory is not without holes. That's not why I'm sharing this. I think there are a bunch of really great ideas here, but like a lot of my videos, it's more so bringing up really interesting details that are amazing on their own, but connect in an invigorating way. And so one last thing about Pluton and the counterweapon is, a lot of people think Franky has been creating portions of Pluton as a path towards the end of the story. The popular one being the Thousand Sunny, and a sub-context is the Gao Cannon, or it might be that Franky's mechas relate here. But there's one interesting one, which is docking number 4, which switched to docking number 6 after the time skip. And for some reason, Oda kept this detail even though it feels like a gag, and even I'm saying it feels like a gag, and it still could be. But if you didn't know, docking number 4 was technically just empty. What it really is an inflatable pool that allows you to float on the water, in water, and to me, I can't help but think that reminds me of Wano, just a water bucket in the ocean. And I wonder why Oda has kept that within the context of Franky's grander inventions. That could have been easily separated, but it's within Franky's resume now. So a pool of water could potentially be important for some reason. But there's another thing that I thought was interesting. When you consider Wano, it contains all the ingredients to potentially revive Pluton if it were a cloud. If you remember how island clouds were manipulated, for one thing, there was a place, probably one of the only real places outside of Wano, where construction was made out to be a major component of the island. And that was Skypiea, where they have a cloud quarry, not too different from a stone quarry. They have to cut clouds, which just sounds so Wano-like. But also Pagaya tells us that these island and sea clouds have completely different condensation nuclei from normal clouds. You see, there's a mineral known as sea prism stone in the blue sea. Then he goes on to say there's an ingredient in it called pyrobloin. Particles of keratin are hurled into the sky by volcanoes and they absorb moisture. Depending on their density, they either become sea clouds or island clouds. I wonder if you can make a ship cloud, for example. It would probably take incredible craftsmen who just happen to be continuously centralized around Wano, and one of the main ingredients of these clouds happens to be sea prism stone, which also is centralized around Wano, which we still don't really know why. But imagine it has something to do with the volcano, which is yet another reason why these island clouds are probably connected to Wano, one of the few volcanic islands that nearly has all of the ingredients to make the clouds. Plus it has a random pool of fresh water that has to come from somewhere. Now with all of this, I have yet to share my main reason for liking this theory. It's because of what Oden said actually. See, at the end of Sukiyaki's explanation of Pluton, Robin asks a really important question. Opening the country will release the weapon? But why did Kozuki Oden want to do such a thing? That's really important, right? Because what we realize is that Oden wanted to open the borders of Wano. That was his dying wish and the mission that motivated him to survive as much as he did. After returning from Laugh Tale with Roger, he seemed to have realized that Joy Boy needs Pluton. What he says exactly is this: I would like to open up this country. Long ago, the ones responsible for closing this nation to the rest of the world were the Kozuki clan. It was to protect Wano from a great external power. Wano? No. The entire world awaits a figure, Joy Boy most likely, and when that figure appears after an 800-year span, which also lines up with Nika, this country must be prepared to welcome and work with them, and concludes again, I want you to open up Wano in my stead. So from this, we gather that Pluton is crucial for Joy Boy. Coming from a man who knows the Void Century history and Wano's history personally, he wanted to open up Wano's borders for Luffy, Nika, Joy Boy, all essentially in this moment meaning the same thing, so that would kind of mean that Pluton is something that would synergize with Luffy. Given his name is Monkey, the obvious Hanuman connection, and the ties to the Monkey King and inspirations from Wukong and Goku, Pluton being a cloud would essentially be Luffy's Nimbus cloud, which would look so cool, right? Top of that, I know many people have drawn the narrative tie of Nami to Sun Wukong and Nimbus, which would still fit amazingly because if a cloud is Luffy's ship, then Nami would be the navigator still. And I have mentioned this before, but Weatheria is a confirmed artificial island, so it's not so far removed from being a possibility. And Weatheria is interesting for so many other reasons, especially because Nami actually interacted with it and learned about it for 2 years. I have one more really solid idea for what Pluton is, and I left breadcrumbs in this video about it. I'll share that in a part 2 that should come out very close to this one, and I'll give a hint, it's a pretty cool theory. But that being said, even with my own ideas, my current favorite Pluton theory is Dax Sake's Pluton is a mole theory. It sounds crazy at first, but if you listen to the theory that I've mentioned before on my channel and on streams, then you know it's actually really well grounded. It also ties so many narrative clues that make so much sense within the picture of Pluton, and it fits really well thematically in my opinion as well. Some of my favorite clues about it is one of the core tenets of this theory is that the mole on Arabasta, who is known as the boss of the earth, is pilotable, and on his hat he has not just the symbol of Japan and Wano, but also Mount Fuji, making it a ship that connects to Wano. But also one last tidbit is that the most absurd port in Wano that shoots straight from Old Wano to New Wano and could also have a port down to where Pluton supposedly rests is a vertical port, and that port's name is Mole Port. In Japanese it's Mogura Port, and there's so many more intricate details that continue to grow on me. And so if you haven't seen Dax Sake's YouTube channel yet, definitely go there and show him some love. Dax and I had a really amazing stream after 1063, and I want to thank Dax immensely for helping me get this video out to you all. And with that, definitely let me know what you think Pluton is. Given our creative and crazy ideas, I have one more that I'm really excited to share, and I'm interested to see if anyone in the comments nail it. I'll shout you out in the next video if you manage to guess my other Pluton option. If you enjoyed this video, please drop a like. please share and subscribe. Check out all my other links for social media because I am everywhere, and I love seeing you all in the most random places. Wherever it might be, I'm looking forward to seeing you again. And so, like always, thank you for connecting with me, and I'm looking forward to connecting with you all on the next ParVision.